Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes to make sure that everyone who wants to be here is here. And sometimes people take a few minutes. We're just going to wait 1 more minute to see if anyone else joins, and then we'll begin. Yep, we've got a few more people. Okay, I think we'll start. There'll probably be some more people popping in through the talk, but that's okay. I can admit them as we go. So welcome everybody to this session. We're from the global perspectives on basic income, and we're looking at from idea to reality in the Netherlands, Portugal, for the whole of Europe. We have some amazing guest speakers with us, and I'll pass over to them in a moment. But first, just some boring housekeeping. Which is if you can have your microphone muted when you're not talking, it will stop the speaker being cut over or the recording going wrong because of background sounds. If you can speak slowly and clearly so that the closed caption subtitles at the bottom work, that would be brilliant. We are recording this session, but mainly just the speaker section. And when we go to question and answers at the end, we'll stop the recording and not put anyone on camera who doesn't want to be on camera. For questions to our lovely speakers, it won't work on Zoom. There's no Zoom chat for our attendees. So if you go to the Hoover webpage where you found the information for this event, that's the chat that you want to write in, and that's where the question and answers tab is. So if you have a question, can you please ask at the start of the question, put the name of the person you're directing the question to, and I'll work through them, and then at the end I can pass them on to the relevant people. If anyone has any extra accessibility needs, you can message me directly on Hoover, or if you feel comfortable messaging in the chat, then go for it and we'll try and accommodate as best as possible. And I'm just going to finish up by reading the Congress mission statement that the volunteers worked on together. So here at Congress, we believe that freedom from poverty and human security should be a basic human right. And we believe that basic income is the best method of transferring this right into a living reality. The time for basic income has come. So we're here to talk about how we make it happen, and we can only achieve this through cooperation and collaboration. Our mission with this Congress was to bring speakers from all over the world together to take this basic income idea and make it reality. And I will now pass you over to Alexander, if you want to introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll go straight into your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Alexander de Roux, and I have been in the executive of BN from 86 until 2004, so that's almost 20 years. I was treasurer. I was one of the founders of the Green Party in Holland. I represented the Green Party in the European Parliament for 5 years. And the last 6 years, I'm the president of the Dutch association, Vereniging Basisinkomen, the Dutch branch of BN in the Netherlands. I will talk about 10 minutes, and I have 7 points to make. The first point. In the 80s, we had a lot of unemployment in Holland. We had 12% general unemployment and 25% youth unemployment. And that led to the enormous and a quite fanatical discussion about basic income. The Greens partly adopted basic income, and the Social Democrats almost adopted basic income. And there was an enormous discussion because the Christian people said, well, it says in the Bible, you have to work for your money. And the right-wing liberals said, well, it just creates laziness. And the unemployed people said, if the system cannot provide us with a job, then the system should provide us with an income, a basic income. And at that time, only 18% of the population was in favor of a basic income, and 82% was against. Then the economy grew and the discussion died out. But we, as a small organization, kept the flame on, and we kept on discussing basic income. And around 2012, we had a new start of the discussion. Our organization, we did participate in the European campaign to collect signatures for European basic income, and we collected 20,000 signatures. And we had a famous figure now, Rutger Bregman, who wrote a book in Dutch about free money for all. And there were also several television programs. So that started a new discussion. And we have seen in opinion polls that now around 50% of the population is in favor, but also still 50% against. And now the unemployment is very low, but we still have an enormous discussion about basic income. Why is that? I see two reasons. The first reason is that the labor market has changed. We have now 50% who have regular fixed jobs with a pension, etc. And the other half, they are either unemployed, or they have precarious jobs, or they are self-employed. And for that half, the present social welfare system, which is quite good in Holland, makes no sense. So half the population has no benefit from the present system. And the other reason, and that's more detailed, is we have now a poverty trap. 50 years ago, one wage income was enough to provide the whole family. Nowadays, two partners are working, and still it is not enough money for a decent life. And in the last 15 years, different governments have introduced 5 income support measures to help people, not only people long-term unemployed, but basically half the population. So you get a supplement for care costs, you get a supplement for children, you get a supplement for child benefit, and there are 2 tax deductions, and all those 5 instruments are income related. Plus we had an old instrument for rent. So we have now 6 measures to help the lower half of the population, and the result is an enormous poverty trap. So if you earn extra money, or if you get a job at all, 80 to 90% of your earnings are taken away. So the poverty trap is now basically for half the population. And that explains why more people find basic income a serious alternative to discuss. 2 times the last years, basic income have been discussed on the government level. 1994, it was the end of the discussion of the 80s, and 2 leaders, one of the socialists and one of the right-wing liberals, proposed it, but the parties as a whole were not ready for it, so it died out. 2017, 4 years ago, the Greens wanted to go to government, and they advocated a finish-style experiment. And the other parties were willing to give that as for the Greens, just like it happened in Ireland. But in the end, the Greens decided not to go to government because they were not satisfied about climate change program and about income measurements. One of the reasons why basic income is still difficult is the financial objective. Holland, we basically invented capitalism 400 years ago. People are very thinking about money, so can you afford it? You cannot afford it. And also the right wing has been forcefully arguing, it's too expensive. So we made a new proposal, and we called it Basic Income 2.0. And that is every adult gets 600 euros. Each household, whether alone or together with 2 people, gets 600 euros. And all the children get 300 euros, which is 3 times as much as now. That proposal got a good press 2 years ago, and it ended up being seriously discussed by civil servants, and they're making official government calculation how you can finance such a scheme. And the other thing we did as an organization in Holland, we started to work with working groups inside political parties for basic income. So the Greens have a working group, basic income. The left-wing liberals, like the Lib Dems in England, they have a working group on basic income, and the Social Democrats too. So that was very useful when it came for the 2021, this year, election in the spring. The government had tumbled. The government had tumbled about a supplement scandal. 30,000 people, 30,000 families, I have to say, they got this money to put your children in child care. And the government falsely accused those 30,000 families of fraud. In the end, it was not the people who frauded, it was the government who had it completely wrong, and they had to admit it. And there was a big scandal which lasted for almost a year, almost every day on television, with crying people. Mostly. So that had a big political impact. So the political parties are now ready to go to a new system. No longer these problems. And at the last election this spring, we had 6 parties advocating and mentioning basic income in their party program. That was the Animal Rights Party, it was the Social Democrats, it was the Greens, it was the left-wing Liberals, it was the Christian left-wing party, and it was the new party Volt, which is now a European party. So our aim now in the immediate future is to get a partial basic income realized. We argue that do away with these supplements and give every adult a basic income of around 600 euros. Now the Greens and the left-wing Liberals are pushing that. We still don't know which parties are going to form the government, but it could be that both the Greens and the left-wing Liberals are part of this government. And it is interesting to know that our biggest party, the right-wing Liberals of Mark Rutte, who was already 10 years in power, they almost adopted the same formula as the left-wing Liberals. In the end, they didn't do it because they already advocated a higher minimum wage. They have never, ever advocated a higher minimum wage. So they said internally, well, we made one move to the left, that's enough. And the other parties, we are a country with a lot of parties in the government, the other parties will ask for a negative income tax or a partial basic income. So the other parties will have to make concessions to us, for instance, on migration or something else. So that's why we have exciting times in Holland that maybe a partial basic income, they will not call it a basic income, they will give it another name. Well, we don't care about the name as long as it's hard currency for people who need it most. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you. Is there anyone who has a direct question for Alexander now? It would be quite good to answer them straight off the back of that if anyone has a pressing question. If not, if you want to think about it later, you can pop it in the Q&A chat on Hoover. Nope. Okay. We will move on now to Sharabi, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, everyone. Just give me a second to share my screen. Okay, I hope this is visible to everyone. Yeah, okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarabi. I am originally from Mumbai, India, but I've been working on this project on UBI in Portugal for better part of this year. And I'm also studying currently in the Netherlands at the International Institute of Social Studies, where I'm majoring in social policy. So I was very interested in what Alexander was saying, and definitely very relevant to also the work that we are doing here in Portugal. So we're going to talk about the formative research that we have been doing as part of the UBI pilot leading up to the process of implementation. So we haven't implemented the UBI pilot yet, but we wanted to do a precursor research before we even design and co-create the pilot with the community. So these are the findings from that particular research phase. And my colleagues, Katarina and Rui, are here as well. And Katarina will be speaking as part of the presentation in the second half, and Rui is here. So he's from Alcácer. So if you have more questions about Alcácer itself, you can always send your questions in the chat. The project is called Alcácer for 21st Century, a vision to achieve economic and social justice for all. This was essentially conceptualized by Rui and myself, I think, during the pandemic last year. I think we were just trying to figure out what's happening in the world at that point of time. And we really recognized the lack of help and support that a lot of communities had during that very tumultuous time in human history. And I think I was in India at that time, so I could see the real economic catastrophe that the pandemic was causing, but it wasn't very different from what was happening in Portugal as well. So a big impetus for why we even thought of and conceptualized this project came from what was happening during the pandemic. And we believe that universal basic income can be an important tool, not just for economic redistribution, but also for transforming, the vision we have for achieving social justice for communities around the world. So not just in Portugal, but also in other parts of the world. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 phases to this project. So there's formative research, which is what we're going to dive deeper into today. We'll talk a bit about where we are with the pilot implementation phase, and then the impact and advocacy, something we're still working through at this moment. So why Alcácer? So Alcácer is, and this is beautiful, some beautiful photos of Alcácer. It's a small city in, you can see here in the map, south of Lisbon. Really pretty city. I've had the opportunity to visit it a few times, and it's a small city with a sizable population, but you also recognize the, the economic consequences the city has faced over the last few decades since Portugal became part of the European Union. And it has some challenges, such as, there's been a big exodus of young people from the city, especially after they finish high school. A lot of them don't have universities there to study in, so they go to other parts of the city, other parts of the country, or they move to other parts of EU as well for work and opportunities. But there's also a big elderly population because a lot of young people have emigrated out of the city itself. And there's a lot of seasonal work happening in this city. So the work that's happening is temporary, it's seasonal. The labor structure or the labor workforce is really dependent on the seasonal work that happens in the city. And so lack of stable employment and opportunities for people are quite limited. And it also has some of the worst indicators in terms of wages, education, per capita spending power, and also birth rates. But we also felt like this was, and of course it was reeling under the impact of the pandemic last year, but we also felt that this was quite an idyllic place to actually implement or try out a UBI pilot, which would potentially be Portugal's first ever universal basic income pilot in practice. So the research methodology, we conducted more qualitative studies rather than quantitative one. We had 8 focus group discussions. So there were total 63 people that we interviewed as part of these focus group discussions. This was done mostly earlier during this year in May and June. And the focus group discussions were categorized based on gender, age, income level, and nationality status. So we also did a couple of focus group discussions with immigrants who live in and around Alcácer. And we also really wanted this research to be a community-led in essence. So we had high school students in Alcácer who, were looking for research experience or wanted to know more about UBI or had never heard about UBI, but were curious or interested in the research aspect of it. And so we decided to involve them as research assistants. So, they were helping out with transcription of notes. They were actually note-taking during the focus group discussions. There was also a session done in their school that Katarina and Rui led with young people in high school about UBI itself. So we saw that there was a lot more engagement, curiosity from the community itself about universal basic income. And we really felt that it could help in making the community own the project in a way. So it's not someone from the outside coming and doing it, but really something that's community-led and co-created by the community itself. And the 4 themes that we covered in the focus group discussions were, we wanted to know more about their sense of the community itself, not just during the pandemic and what the pandemic is bringing forth now in the future, but also before the pandemic had hit. The Portuguese had experienced a financial crisis and then the migration crisis, and what has it meant in terms of their ideas and notions about the community in Alcácer itself. We wanted to talk about deservingness, which is how other groups or communities or populations are perceived by the Portuguese or by the immigrants in terms of who deserves welfare benefits. So in this case, universal basic income. We also want to test their notions on work and productivity. Where do they come from? Can UBI help in challenging some of those notions itself? And then we wanted to know more of their views about UBI policy itself. Did they know about it? What did they think could be the minimum amount or basic income that we could think of as something that we want to posit in the UBI pilot. So I'll dive a bit deeper into the findings on deservingness in particular, and then Katerina will come in and talk a bit more about the rest of the themes. So deservingness, just a bit conceptual information here. Deservingness is a foundational plank of how social welfare policymaking has existed for centuries now. It's really about how we look at groups as being targeted for particular welfare benefits and how we think of who deserves those benefits, right? So we see a lot of social policies, not just in Portugal or EU, but also in India, for instance. And we often look at social policies targeting the poorest or the most marginalized. And in that sense, we say that these are a group or community of people who are most deserving of certain benefits over others. And it's not just in terms of design of the policy itself, but also for social legitimacy of the welfare policies and programs in popular discourse and in political discourse as well. And the primary deservingness literature, which is also something that I'm researching at this current moment for my master's thesis, but it's more geared towards immigration of South Asian community in Portugal. But what I've been seeing in the literature right now is that the deservingness has really a universal dimension, which has particularly held stable for almost a few decades now in Europe, where we see that, you know, when you ask people, most people would say that the elderly are the most deserving of social benefits, followed by sick and people with disabilities, while those at the bottom are usually single mothers or migrants who are usually perceived the last, or people who are not of the same national origin. And this is the kind of the ladder of deservingness that we have seen from the European social surveys hold steady across the board in EU. So in Portugal also, this is not very different. And we wanted to test through the FGDs if this really held true for Alcácer. So these are the few findings from particularly in the realm of deservingness. So the idea of deservingness we found is intricately linked or tied to the idea of work ethic and ability to work. So really, and I think Katerina will dive deeper into this when she talks about work and productivity findings, but we see that the idea of who's deserving of social benefit is really strongly tied to whether a person is able to work or they are able to prove that they're productive or contributing to the society in some way or the other. And we have some example quotations from the FGDs. I won't read them out, but you can obviously follow them along. And of course, among both men and women, we found that above the age of 35 years, we found that this universal dimension of support really held strong, which is that those who are older and especially unemployed, so especially after the financial crisis in Portugal, we saw that a lot of older people lost their jobs as well. So old and unemployed are the most deserving of benefits, followed by those with disabilities or someone who has health issues. While those who are young and unemployed are really at the bottom rung of deservingness, and followed by immigrants themselves. So we see that among both men and women, regardless of gender and above the age group of 35, we see this as sort of holding steady. But when we move on to younger people, we find that these deservingness trends are actually shifting. So among young people below the age of 35, we found that they would say that single mothers are more deserving. And we found that there's a much more strong awareness of gender dimension here, right? So they agree that women are at a disadvantage or disproportionately burdened by certain aspects of the societal, the way the society is structured. And they think that women in some ways are more deserving than men. So we see that gender dimension playing very strongly. And we also see that they see that young and unemployed are actually more deserving of social welfare benefits than the more traditional deservingness order. So that was very interesting to us to see who says who's deserving and why. And this is more important in terms of how we design the pilot later on, because we want to make sure that it caters to the ones who are most at need of the UBI, but we also want to make sure that it caters to a buy-in from the community, which means we have to engage in certain negotiations and dialogue with the community, because we see that not everyone's on the same page when we talk about deservingness. And the criteria of need was also expressed very strongly in as a defining feature of deservingness. So of course, I don't think it's surprising, but we see that people who are deemed as most needing of help or support are considered more deserving. And we see that in the deservingness ladder that I just mentioned as well. However, when we go to the group with immigrants, we see that the deservingness perceptions actually differ. Among the group of immigrants, we see that the first that they see as most deserving is unemployed. And for them, for where they're located within the broader Portuguese society, it makes sense, because when immigrants come into the Portuguese society, they often struggle to find jobs, to find the dignity of labor. And I think for them, it becomes a more important element of how they define deservingness compared to native Portuguese people. And we also see that for them, single mothers would come second. So again, it's the dynamics of the immigrant community and how they have those lived experiences that shape their ideas of how deservingness outlines for them. But similar to older age cohort, among immigrants, you see these age differences as well. Gender distinction is not particularly strong. And in our immigrant group in the FGDs, we had relatively older immigrants, so we didn't see the gender dimension really being highlighted. But if we had more time and if we could gather more younger immigrant groups, it would be interesting to see if they kind of overlap with what we see with young people who are native of Alcácer, for instance. It's also interesting to see how immigrants perceive themselves. There is an acknowledgement that they don't receive help from social workers, or they lack the support they need to access social benefits. But they do believe that having a Portuguese representation, for instance, would bolster their cause of receiving those benefits. So they feel that if they had a Portuguese representative in the parliament, for instance, more likely that they will be seen more deserving of benefits, or they're more likely to have easier access to social welfare benefits in that sense. And this was interesting because from my own research for my graduate degree, what I'm finding is that a lot of immigrant communities tend to be very tight-knit and isolated from the mainstream. And this lack of connect between the mainstream Portuguese society and immigrant communities can often serve as an important barrier for them in accessing social welfare benefits itself, even if the policy on paper is really open and liberal. But in practice, that often never translates. So yeah, these were some of our findings from the FGDs on deservingness in particular. So the key takeaway is that for all of those above the age of 35, the universal dimension of deservingness really holds steady, but this changes for younger folks, where gender dimension and the age dimension becomes much more highlighted and much more stronger. And while the ability to work is really rooted in who deserves what in terms of social welfare benefits, we also see that while people would be happy to have universal welfare benefits, which means that they're happy as long as they're getting something out of it as well, and their neighbor gets something out of it, when we start unpacking conditionality, we see that it becomes a lot more complicated of how people understand or conceptualize UBI itself. Now I'll pass it on to Katerina to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Surabi. I'm going to try to ask you for control so that you don't have to move the slides if you can accept it. Otherwise, I'll ask you to do it. Okay, have you accepted?
Yes, you should now have ability to share.
Okay, I'm actually not able, so I'm going to share myself, Surabi. I think it's easier so that you don't have to move it for me. So thank you very much to everyone, and also to Surabi. So my name is Katerina Neves. I've been working in my PhD on UBI and reciprocity in the Center for Ethics, Politics and Society from University in Braga, Portugal. And I've been very thankful to be able to work with both Surabi and Rui in the project that they are doing in Alcácer. And I'm going to move on faster, because I don't know how much time we have left, but probably not a lot. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our findings on work and contribution, which are very much in line with what Surabi was talking about in terms of deservingness. And then I'll move on to the topic of UBI, how people perceived of the idea of UBI. And we'll finish off with community, because I think it's interesting for you to know about what people say in terms of Alcácer as a community. So one of the key things that we discussed with the people in our focus groups was, what is being productive? What do they think makes someone productive? And then we try to connect it with the issues of deservingness and work ethic, and also very much in line with the things that they experience in their work life. And one of the key findings is in line with what Surabi already said. So work and work ethic is quite significant for most of our participants. So most of them said that contributing in a productive manner, like work-like manner, was very important. It was essential, and for some was deemed as obligatory to be part of a given community. However, saying this does not necessarily mean that they meant, all of them, that we do have to be engaged in the formal employment, because in fact, one of the things that I think we were surprised is that the conception of work was broader than one could expect. So people did say that people have to work within the community, but when we told them to rank and to discuss what is work on a very broad range of occupations, from being a caretaker, from being an artist, from being a student, up into a manager, a farmer, or working in social assistance, for example, most people in our focus groups, if not all, said that each of these occupations was deemed as work. So it was quite broad what they considered to be work. Hence, it was quite broad what they considered people had to do in order to be part of the community, and also to be considered as productive citizens, if we can use this word. Nonetheless, we had some differences. Surabi was talking a lot about how difference in perception in terms of age, how youngsters and older people saw deservingness. But we also had very significant, although we have a limited sample, but significant differences in how women and men perceived work. In fact, and this is quite common, women considered work as relevant when they were discussing benefits mostly, and work in this broader sense. So in general, they said that if we are discussing who should be entitled to receive benefits or not, we should consider if people work in this broad set of occupations. Whereas men typically, and middle-aged older men typically, said that work is important not only to decide who should be entitled to receive benefits, but also as something you have to do with your life, something you have to do to fulfill your life. So it's not only a criteria to give off benefits or to restrict benefits, but it's also kind of a category to say that someone is fulfilling what he or she should do in his or her life, which is quite different. And from this discussion on what do you consider to be work, what makes someone productive, how men and women perceive work, we then flow into a discussion of commitment, which was interesting, and it was much more, women more commonly discussed this issue of commitment, but is saying not only work is important when we are discussing benefits in case of women, or when we are discussing what to do with our lives, but most importantly, maybe we should discuss commitment. And we remember some women saying that commitment is important on a broad range of things: commitment towards one's family, towards one's community, towards one's workplace, towards one's country. So it's commitment that should be the restriction or the criteria to give off benefits and to say that someone is a willingly and a productive participant of a given community. And this issue of, is work ethic that should restrict or not benefits, or that should deem if we are a productive citizen, or that should deem that we are a participant, a committed participant on the community, is very linked not only with the findings Surabi present you on deservingness, but also on the reciprocity, on a reciprocity concept, and namely then on the usually reciprocity objection to basic income. This idea of saying that we should not be granting benefits to those who are not willingly participants of one's community, because we all should do our part in the community. And it was interesting to see that some do indeed connect doing your part with work, whereas others say, no, it's not work, it might be a very broad set of occupations, or it might simply mean being committed to one's community, to one's family, to one's workplace, for example. And you can see also here, as Surabi was presenting, some of the quotes that we have on commitment and on productive participation. I'm going to move a little bit quicker so that we can go into UBI. And finally, when we were going over the findings, both on deservingness, but then on work and productivity, we find that across all our focus groups, we had a certain social stratification. We had a first group, which was those who work and do so productively. And it's basically the group that everyone in the focus groups, not surprisingly included themselves in, which are those who are seen as honest people, who do their fair share, who work every day, who pay their taxes, who contribute to their family and to the community. And these people are considered as productive and willing members of the community. A second group is more or less related with those who are deserving of benefits. Those are the ones who are seen as needing help and are rightfully entitled to it. And usually are either those who are not able-bodied people, either because they have a form of disability, illness, impairment, or surprisingly also, some people, especially women, discussed parts of the population who have many responsibilities they cannot bear, for example, single mothers. But again, and this is connected with the issue of need that Surabhi said, and no one in our focus groups directly included themselves in this group, surprisingly too, because it's a difficult thing to do, but they recognize that these people deserve benefits. And then the third one, which is a welfare trope that most people know, and it's a particular kind is specific, I think, to Portugal, which is the broad group of those who take advantage, but that in our focus groups were called the people who hang out in cafes or in bars every single day. And it was surprising because this welfare trope appeared in every social focus group, from the youngsters into the older ones, into immigrants. So it's an idea that a lot of people take advantage of benefits, they don't need them, and they do so by hanging out in the cafes. And no one in the focus groups included themselves in this group. And also when you inquired of how many people do you know in this group, what kind of people are in this group, the answers were really not very specific. People seem to have this general idea, this general ideal type, but then they cannot really connect it to a particular segment of the population, 10%, 5%, Joana, Miguel, different names of the people, they really cannot do it. So it's a welfare trope, but it's a very entrenched one, particularly in the community of Alcácer do Sal. And so this was the general discussions on work and productivity. Now let's move on to unconditional basic income. And let me know if I'm hanging out of time so that I can go faster. So when we discussed unconditional basic income, the first thing we asked was, do people know the concept? And 95% of the people on the focus group did not know what a UBI was. And the people who did, the 5% who did, knew it very sparsely. So they really were not aware of what UBI is. And then we asked, okay, UBI is unconditional, is universal, should allow to live a life with dignity. We explained the concept and then asked, what do you think about being universal, being entitled to everyone? And we had different sets of answers. So some people said that it would be very good to receive an extra income. And as Surabhi said, this is because Alcácer is a very poor community. So the average wage is much lower than in most places in the country, which means that people really recognize that an extra additional income would be important for them and also for many people in the community. But nonetheless, in terms of universality, we had two perspectives. One said that the UBI being universal was good or not problematic because it was fair to give it to everyone, which is connected with what Surabhi said, but also because it would allow savings and it streamlined bureaucracy, which would make it very good. Whereas then we had a second part of the population who said, no, universal might not be so good because in fact, we will be giving money to people who are well off, people who are rich, and they don't need to receive it. One point. And the second point, which is we are not going to do anything to take care of inequality. We would prefer to have more redistributive measures in the sense of giving to those who have less instead of giving to everyone. So those were the two perspectives on universality. But again, most people said, I'm okay with being universal. We all need it. It would be good. It would be fair. It would allow to streamline bureaucracy. Then the problem, like it usually is with UBI, is being unconditional a good thing? Is it fair? Should we have it? And we had different perspectives. So some said it's bad because some people will not work. And this was very close. It was a perspective from a lot of male people in the focus groups, which makes sense according to what I told you about work, but also people with lower income who said a lot of people live off benefits. I'm not able to go to the cafes. I'm not able to spend my money as I would like, and I'm working. I don't think it's fair that some people will not work, whereas I have to work and will receive this. So I don't think this is okay. Where others said, and these also were sometimes a small correlation with people who have more income, who said it's bad to give people money unconditionally because people would make poor choices with the money. They need to be educated. They don't know what to do, which is the paternalistic objection to UBI. And it's funny how this was more or less poor, not so super strong, but maybe it would be stronger if we have a bigger sample, correlated with income. Lower income think people should work. I'm working, everyone should work to receive it. Higher income seem to think, no, it's bad because lower income people or people who take advantage will receive it and won't know what to do with the money, or will do things that are incorrect or not good for them and for their families. There were some small segments of the population of the focus groups who said, no, nonetheless, being unconditional is good. It will teach people how to use their freedom. It will make people freer and have the opportunity to make their choices, but those were not the biggest perceptions that we have. And just another point is saying that when discussing that unconditionality was bad, it was always geared towards the worst off. So people would say, no, I would use the money correctly. No, I will continue working, but I know people who won't work, or I know people who won't know how to use the money, which is a common perspective when we talk about objections to UBI. Nonetheless, finally, to conclude on the findings on UBI, most people said that UBI nonetheless makes sense. It would be either outweighed in terms of its benefits, considering its problems, or nonetheless it could be good to pilot it. So everyone, regardless of what they thought about being unconditional or universal, said, okay, I can agree to a pilot. We have problems, we have challenges. Maybe it would be good to have a pilot of a UBI implemented here to see how people actually will behave when receiving the money, which is something that was surprising considering the heated discussions that we had on UBI, but I think we were happy. And let me just check if Joanna, do I have 2 minutes just to finish off the findings on community?
Take your time.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So finally, we discussed with people what do they thought about as Alcácer do Sal as a community, which was important because of what Surabi was saying, to build on the pilot, understand how people perceived of Alcácer do Sal as a community. That, as we told you, is a poor community. It doesn't have a lot of people, has a lot of elderly people, but it's very also geographically dispersed. It's the second, I think Rui told me once that it's the second biggest in terms of geography municipality in the country. So it has very few people, but it's quite big in terms of territory. And surprisingly, when discussing community, people had a lot of things to say. They really enjoyed doing it. And they had we were able to uncover two main perceptions, negative ones, but this is common in Portugal. So the first one was a very strong perception that came across again in all focus groups. And this is a translation, so it doesn't sound as good as it would in Portuguese. People said, Alcácer é madrasta, não é mãe, which means Alcácer do Sal is a better stepmother than mother to those who live in the city. And this meant that people really believed that Alcácer do Sal as a municipality welcomed foreigners from other places of the country or from other places in the world better than it did to those who have lived in Alcácer for quite a while or whose family resides in Alcácer for quite a few years. And this was striking. Sometimes in smaller communities, this does not happen. People are quite closed and prefer those who have lived there for quite a while instead of foreigners. But here, everyone said the opposite. They said, no, they are much more welcome to those that come from other places. They value their businesses more. They value their ideas more than they do with people who have been in Alcácer for quite a while. And you can see here, there are poems about it. Immigrants also knew this perspective. People who are younger, people who have more money, who have less money, older people, everyone seemed to know this expression and felt that they should convey it when we were discussing community in Alcácer. The second perspective was, yes, Alcácer is strong, despite receiving outsiders better. Alcácer is strong. When we had the pandemic, we helped each other out. When someone needs something, we find a way to give it to those who need it. But individualism is growing. And there was a sense of a romantic take on older times, namely from older people from 50, 60, 70 years old, who were saying that before the community really knew each other and really helped out in a different way, and there was cultural and community initiatives, whereas today there's very few things for the community. People live in their shelves, do not want to cooperate, do not want to share things with other people. And you have different things here. People are egoistic, are not paying attention, they don't help out. Some people said that people only help others because they want to be better perceived by others instead of doing it because it's part of their communities. So it was a very strong also perception. And it was explained by different factors. Some people said that it was a growing trend in Portugal and in the world, so Alcácer was being plagued by it. Other people said that it was because of growing tourism and gentrification that was eroding community links. A strong perception to explain it was also that Alcácer has very different communities. So people said that in the urban city of Alcácer, the one that Surabi showed the pictures, this was more common, this individualism, whereas in other places like Torrão, smaller places within the municipality, this was not so strong. And then a very strong perception was also that either they have very little cultural activities now and the municipality and the governments are to blame, or the problem is youngsters. Youngsters do not want to engage, want to be in social media, do not want to participate in the community. So they are the ones who are contributing to this erosion of the community. And this was an important and interesting finding for us when thinking about the pilot, because at the same time, many of the problems that we surveyed and that we research about the community was that it doesn't have young people. People are fleeing Alcácer. They do not stay there. They do not study there, do not work there. And so the city is becoming it doesn't have people to engage and invest there. So it's interesting that this has happened. And alongside this, people also think that youngsters are the one more or less to blame for this growing individualism. And now we have just two final discussions on moving forward and questions and aspects. I don't know, Surabi, if you want to chip in here, and I can also contribute if you want.
Yeah, sure, I can. So maybe you can just move to the next slide. So what has happened since the findings? We have, it's I think encouraging that we have some media reportage about the pilot itself. So there is some momentum around UBI within the broader media and I guess policy discourse in Portugal as well. We have also been directly engaging with the municipality in Alcácer towards a formal endorsement in the form of a manifesto to show official support of the UBI itself. And we have been engaging with people. We do want to take these findings back to them. We want to share what's come out of the research and then use it as a plank to then perhaps co-create the design and an implementation process of the pilot. So as I mentioned earlier, we very much want this to be a community-owned and community-led project. And so I think we really feel that taking the findings back to the community is incredibly important. And then beyond UBI, I think, the findings have provided so much more material for further research questions. And it'd be interesting to see where we take them, and maybe Katerina will have something more to say about that. And moving on to the next slide, I think that's the last one. Yeah, the current challenges, I think as we start thinking more about the implementation itself, fundraising is something that we are really grappling with at this point. And we'd love to hear from people in the session right now, and if they have any ideas on how we can do some fundraising for the pilot. And there are different models for fundraising around the world, which, places that have experimented with UBI. But if people have any suggestions, we'd love to hear more. And then we would also like to hear any feedback on designing the pilot itself. I think that's the most important second phase that we are now embarking on after the findings. There's also, I think, and I saw a question in, I think, the app itself, which was like, how do you keep the momentum going? And that's something that we'll have to, keep engaging with. And I think Rui will we will talk more about it. It's a lot of hard work to keep the momentum going, to keep talking with people in the community, with the municipality, with officials, and not lack the momentum that we have created because of the research phase. And then challenging notions of deservingness itself. I think those findings can be incredibly important in framing the public messaging around UBI itself. And that's something that can become a broader goal for advocacy around a policy change on UBI and Alcácer and other parts of Portugal. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
Obrigado. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Wow, that's fascinating. I also want to give Alexander the opportunity to answer that question that was put in the question and answer, which says, I think in the last 18 months, we have all seen the introduction of new government benefits, emergency payments and community support schemes, but how do we keep the momentum going? So it'd be great to have your opinion on that, Alexander.
Well, we keep momentum going by being public. So what we do is the demonstration. We have now each year a demonstration in Amsterdam, so we get visibility through that. And this year we have an extra item, and that we have a meeting in the church, a big church in Amsterdam, where politicians come from 6-7 different parties, and where 4 people, Dutch people who wrote recently this year a book about basic income, will present their book. So we have a double input. We have the demonstration, and we have the political meeting plus the books. That will create attention. So you have to find again and again ways to get the thing into publicity. And we manage well on newspapers and on radio, on television. It is a little bit more difficult.
Lovely, thank you. And a question to the floor, anyone who's here, what do you think we should do to keep the momentum going? How do we let people who might not even know what UBI is? So many people I speak to have no idea what UBI is, and we're all we know a lot about this small subject, which is obviously huge, but to us, we know the details, and so many people don't even know what universal basic income is. So how do we reach the average person who might not know about it? Is there any thoughts in the room? If you want to react by putting your hand up like this on Zoom, if you know how to do that, then I can see who wants to comment. But yes, maybe have a think about that. And Shirabi, Rui, or Katerina, do you have any thoughts on that? Yes, Katerina.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think, Joanna, I think it's difficult. One of the things that we were moving along to try not to go over time too much, and we did a bit, sorry. But one of the things that we experienced in the focus groups, and Surabi, Rui also, if you want to chip in, because he was also on the focus groups, is that it's really difficult to discuss UBI with people. So we are super engaged with the topic, and we say unconditional, universal, and we already know what it is. But then you explain and say, what do you think about UBI? And either most people do not know it, especially the people that maybe want to engage because it would be important for them to receive it. If it not for everyone, but certainly for some people, it would be super important to receive it. You want to engage with them, and it's difficult, and you have to try to understand what are their agendas. So for example, in the focus groups, a lot of the discussion was, it's important for people to understand that everyone who works will receive it, and everyone who's not working will receive also. And this was already, it seems very simple, but explaining this very clearly, we had to do it for 3 or 4 times so people could understand it. So just, I think that the main point is you have to get the message across. Everyone needs to know what UBI is first, and then we can go and discuss what do people think about it. Otherwise, we are discussing different things and we are not able to agree on it.
Brilliant. And Alexander popped his hand up first, and I'll go back to you, Shirabi.
Well, I've been away 10 years in the discussion in Holland, and when we started again 6 years ago, what we did is handing out leaflets in the busy parts of a city, simply by explaining basic income. And I said, well, what do young people think about basic income? They were not around there 30, 35 years ago. Do they know what basic income is? And it was interesting to find out that young people and also people with a migration background they did know and they were interested. So I was really struck by a young couple, that the guy didn't want to receive the pamphlet, and the young girl, she left the guy and she went back. I want to read about basic income, and then she went back to her guy. So there is an interest because people are looking for something else. They're fed up with the system as it functions now. And what we also do is we have different groups. So we have now 12 cities in Holland where we have local groups, and they're organizing evenings. And okay, you reach only the local press, but that's useful as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And Shirabi and Rui, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think I quickly just wanted to add to what Alexander was saying as well. Like, it really goes back to a sort of door-to-door organizing on UBI, right? Like, you have to get the word across, and it's like a lot of conversations, dialogue with people, with the community. And I think it's okay if we don't necessarily reach the national level right away. It can be very local, very organic in that sense. And I can, I think, also derive some inspiration from, for instance, feminist movements around the world and how they've made that kind of content more accessible to younger people, whether it's on social media or through performance art and, you know, creative methods. I think we can draw some inspiration on UBI from that as well.
Yeah. Just to add some notes on this one, because I was the one that was more engaged with the local community. I think the high school students were brilliant because they helped me out engaging the older ones to actually attend the focus group. So that was really good. On the topic itself, like, of course, it's something new and they perceive as something completely out of the box and modern. But at the same time, the more we question things and we question the role of work, the role of free time in their lives, the more they perceive that maybe it's time to change for something completely new. And to actually give a bit more time for the family, time for yourself as an individual. And those questions came, and I'm local, so the feedback would come in different ways, like even after the focus groups with drinks, and they say there are questions that need to be raised right now about how we live with quality. And lastly, I think, and now it's the two things that I'm more engaged with. It's like to try to get the municipality on board and also some consultant or experts in economic and social issues to make sure that we have a stronger advocacy. Even if they don't totally support UBI, they can support the idea of it's worthwhile to pilot. It's worthwhile to test out. And if especially it's worthwhile to test out in a community that it's small and as their own as its own vulnerabilities. So that's a bit my take on this one.
Brilliant. And I think there's a really specific question for you, I guess, Rui, on the chat, which says, on the community part of your communication, I didn't understand if among those who said that Alcira is a better stepmother than mother included migrants. The surveyed were all Portuguese locals, ? I'm not 100% on that, but if you have an answer for that.
I do have an answer. Like, it is a good stepmother if you come already with an income. Like, if you come to invest in the city, if you come to invest in the business, you are welcome to do that. Or even if you don't have money, but you have a big light to sell, people will welcome you. So to answer the question, yes, there's a bit of the perception that migrant workers are a bit in the lower class, given the current context. Our dynamics are shaped. And also, I noticed something that it's a bit worse because, like, there's a rise of the populism on the right wing here, and it's a consequence of like these categories that we end up doing when we do social welfare. Like, we help the disabled, we help the minorities, we help the Roman people here that are really persecuted in Portugal. They are helped, and people perceive that they are overwhelmed. And then there's a layer of the society that is still poor, that feel a bit neglected. Like, I'm not a drug addict, I don't fit in any of these categories, and I'm not awarded in a way with a benefit. And that balances out the discussion on like which can be positive or negative. In a negative way, it's like it makes people a bit more vulnerable, but on a positive way, it makes them more hopeful, give more hope to the fact that it should be unconditional, it should be for all. So I think that's a good take that we can get out of the focus groups.
Katerina, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm not sure if I understood also the question. I think Rui phrased it and explained it very well. I just wanted to say that in our focus groups, we surveyed mostly people who live in Alcácer. And we had people who lived for quite a while in Alcácer, youngsters who live for a shorter period of time, or who are somewhere else but live most of their lives in Alcácer. And we had a focus groups with immigrants. And when we said that this perception came across in all focus groups, and even the immigrants had already heard the perspective that Alcácer is a better stepmother than the mother, but when they discussed it, they did not said so. So some said that they were very welcoming, that welcomed in the city, but they said some things as Rui is saying. It's different if you are a lower income or if you are a higher income immigrant. But the perspective came across in almost all the focus groups.
Lovely, thank you. And we've got a question specific to Alexander on the question and answer, which is, do you feel that the UBI experiments in Utrecht, etc., help the UBI cause?
Well, I don't think so, but the experiments were very poorly designed, and we had 6 or 7 cities which had experiments, and in all the cities it had different conditions. And for instance, there were cities where people could change from group. So you were divided in 3 groups and people could switch between the groups. So scientifically, it made no sense at all. And also, yeah, well, it did not do our cause good and it did not do our cause bad. It was simply very bad organized experiments, very different to the one in Finland, which was very thoroughly. People had to participate and they had a good result showing that people were more happy and more healthy and even slightly had more increase in labor participation in the traditional way. And that was also in all of that, that was the main question. Does it put more people into paid work? That was the reason the government in the end said yes. And then the researchers tried to smuggle in, yeah, but we also want to measure what does it do with health, etc. So it was 6 very poorly designed experiments, and we better forget about it.
So that's all the questions on the Hoover chat, but does anyone else in the room have any questions for our lovely speakers before we wrap it up? Going to take the silence. No. Yeah, and on behalf of BIEN, thank you so much for everyone who showed up today, and it's so exciting to hear about all the projects that are happening all over the world and all the learning that's happening through potentially misguided projects. So yes, thank you. Please be encouraged to talk to each other on the Hoover private messaging app, or if you want to start little groups that you can talk in more detail about these issues, because obviously they are so huge and it's incredibly difficult to try and fit it all into these times. But yes, thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely day or evening or lunch or whatever time it is wherever you are. Until next time, bye.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you everyone.